In the summer of 1973, roughly 120 descendants of the richest man America had ever produced gathered for a family reunion. Their ancestor had died holding more money than the United States Treasury. His fortune, at its peak, would be worth billions today. And yet, reportedly, among all 120 relatives in that room, there was not one single millionaire. The Vanderbilts didn't just lose the greatest fortune in American history. They obliterated it in barely 3 generations. And the way they did it is one of the most jaw-dropping cautionary tales ever recorded. It began with $100 and a teenager who refused to stay poor. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on May 27, 1794, on Staten Island, New York, to a family of Dutch farmers who scraped a living ferrying produce across the harbor. He quit school at 11. He was rough, profane, and almost feral in his ambition, a boy who would rather fight than read, and who saw the water around New York not as scenery, but as money waiting to be taken. According to family legend, at 16 he borrowed $100 from his mother and bought a small 2-masted sailing barge. With it, he started ferrying passengers and freight between Staten Island and Manhattan for 18 cents a trip. He undercut every competitor, worked in weather that kept other boatmen at home, and paid his mother back within a year. The neighbors mockingly called the teenage ferryman the Commodore. He kept the nickname for the rest of his life, and by the end, nobody was laughing, because that $100 loan was about to become the seed of an empire so vast it would warp American society itself. The Commodore's rise was ruthless and relentless. He moved from sail to steam, building a fleet of steamboats and slashing fares until rivals either went bankrupt or paid him enormous sums just to go away. During the California Gold Rush, he ran a shortcut route through Nicaragua and reportedly pocketed over $1 million a year from desperate prospectors. When business partners tried to cheat him while he was on vacation, he sent them a message that has become legend, that he wouldn't sue them, because the law was too slow. He would simply ruin them. And he did. Then, in his late 60s, an age when most tycoons retire, the Commodore pivoted the entire fortune into railroads. He seized control of the New York Central, consolidated line after line, and built the artery connecting New York to Chicago. He commissioned Grand Central Depot in Manhattan, the ancestor of today's Grand Central Terminal, where his bronze statue still stands. By the 1870s, one man effectively controlled the flow of people and freight in and out of America's greatest city. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, at the age of 82, his fortune stood at roughly $100 million. Reportedly, that was more cash than the United States Treasury held at the time. One man, richer than the government. Adjusted for the scale of the economy, some economists rank him among the wealthiest human beings who have ever lived. And on his deathbed, the old man delivered a warning to his family. He reportedly told them that any fool could make a fortune, but that it took real brains to hold on to one. His descendants would spend the next 90 years proving him right in the most spectacular way imaginable. The Commodore had despised the idea of splitting his empire, so he left almost 95% of everything to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. Billy, as the family called him, had spent decades being dismissed by his father as a soft disappointment. The Commodore had once banished him to a farm on Staten Island, but the quiet heir turned out to be the last Vanderbilt who actually understood money. In just 8 years, William Henry doubled the fortune, from $100 million to nearly $200 million, the equivalent of several billion today, and at the time, quite possibly the largest private fortune on the planet. He also gave the family its most infamous public relations disaster. In 1882, when a reporter questioned him about running trains for profit rather than public benefit, he reportedly snapped 4 words that would haunt the family name forever. "The public be damned." The quote spread everywhere. The Vanderbilts were now not just rich, they were resented. And then, on December 8, 1885, William Henry dropped dead of a stroke in the middle of a business meeting at just 64. He had been the richest man on earth for 8 years, and he reportedly confessed near the end that the fortune brought him nothing but anxiety. His death was the hinge of this entire story. Because unlike his father, William Henry split the money, chiefly between his sons Cornelius II and William Kissam Vanderbilt, with millions more scattered across 6 other children. The fortune was no longer a single unstoppable river. It was a delta, dividing and dividing, and the generation now holding it had been raised with one skill above all others: spending. What followed was the most extravagant burn rate in American history. The 3rd generation of Vanderbilts looked at the greatest pile of money the country had ever seen and decided its true purpose was to buy their way into high society. Because, incredibly, the old money aristocracy of New York still considered the Vanderbilts vulgar new money railroad people and refused to invite them to anything. The family general in this social war was Alva Vanderbilt, the ferociously ambitious wife of William Kissam. In 1883, Alva threw a masquerade ball at her brand-new Fifth Avenue mansion, a limestone French chateau that had cost millions, and the party itself reportedly cost around $250,000, something like $6 million today, for a single night. 1,200 guests, costumes shipped from Paris, and the target of the entire operation was one woman, Mrs. Caroline Astor, the gatekeeper of New York society who had snubbed the Vanderbilts for years. Alva simply declined to invite Mrs. Astor's daughter, until Mrs. Astor personally called on Alva, in effect surrendering. It worked. The Vanderbilts were in. That is certainly one way to buy friends. But the ball was only the opening bid, because the family now entered a building spree that bordered on the unhinged. Along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the Vanderbilts erected a row of palaces so dense that the stretch became known as Vanderbilt Row. 10 mansions for one family, including a 137-room behemoth built by Cornelius II that was the largest private residence New York City has ever seen. In Newport, Rhode Island, they built summer cottages that were cottages the way a battleship is a rowboat. Cornelius II raised the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace completed in 1895, with platinum-paneled walls and a heating system fed by boilers buried beneath the front lawn. His brother William Kissam answered with Marble House, stuffed with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of marble alone. And down in North Carolina, their younger brother George, the bookish one, quietly outdid them all. He built Biltmore, 250 rooms, roughly 179,000 square feet, the largest private home in the United States to this day. It opened on Christmas Eve, 1895. It had an indoor pool, a bowling alley, and its own village. It also devoured so much money that George's finances never truly recovered. After his sudden death in 1914, following complications from an appendectomy, his widow had to sell off most of the surrounding land just to stabilize the estate. None of these palaces produced a single dollar. Every one of them consumed money on a devastating scale. Armies of servants, coal, taxes, upkeep. The fortune was now a bathtub with the drain wide open, and the family was about to discover that even marriages could become luxury purchases. In 1895, Alva Vanderbilt executed her masterpiece and her most heartbreaking act. Her daughter Consuelo, 18 years old, gentle and obedient, was in love with an American. Alva didn't care. She had located a bigger prize, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, an English aristocrat with one of the grandest titles in Britain and, conveniently, a crumbling palace he couldn't afford. Alva reportedly confined her daughter, intercepted her letters, and by some accounts even threatened to shoot the young man Consuelo actually loved. On November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke in New York. By her own later account, she spent the morning of her wedding crying behind her veil. The price of the title was staggering. A dowry of roughly $2.5 million in railroad stock, comfortably north of $70 million today, plus an annual allowance for the Duke. The marriage was miserable almost from the first day, and the couple eventually separated. American millions had bought an English coronet, and everyone involved was wretched. Alva, for what it's worth, later divorced William Kissam in one of the great scandals of the age, married another millionaire, and reinvented herself as a genuinely formidable champion of women's right to vote. The Social General found a better war. Meanwhile, the men nominally in charge of the actual railroad were losing their grip on it and on themselves. Cornelius II, the dutiful head of the family, worked himself into the ground and died in 1899 at just 55 after a series of strokes. And with him died the last generation that even pretended the family business came first. His successors treated the New York Central less like an empire and more like a trust fund with wheels. William Kissam admitted as much with brutal honesty, reportedly lamenting that inherited wealth was a real handicap to happiness, a certain death to ambition. He preferred yachts and racehorses. His son, William K. II, poured his energy into ocean racing and founded an automobile club. Another heir commuted to work by yacht because apparently trains, the source of the entire fortune, were beneath a Vanderbilt. And then there was Reggie. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, youngest son of Cornelius II, never held a job in his life. His occupation, listed in the most generous possible terms, was gentleman sportsman, which in practice meant horses, gambling dens, and heroic quantities of alcohol. He reportedly tore through most of his multi-million-dollar inheritance. And in 1925 he died at 45, his body destroyed by cirrhosis, a bleed his doctors couldn't stop. He left behind a widow and a baby daughter, born just a year earlier, whose custody would soon be fought over in one of the ugliest trials of the century. That baby's name was Gloria Vanderbilt. The press would call her the poor little rich girl. That phrase would turn out to be more accurate than anyone knew. Because while the heirs partied, history itself had turned against them. The blows now landed one after another, each more disastrous than the last. In 1913, the federal income tax arrived, followed by estate taxes that took a scythe to every inheritance as it passed down. In 1929, the stock market crash and the Great Depression vaporized paper fortunes across the family. And beneath it all, the golden goose was dying, the railroad itself. Automobiles, trucks, highways and airlines strangled the passenger rail business decade by decade. The New York Central, the crown jewel, the engine of everything, slid from dominance into decline. The family's grip loosened, then slipped entirely. In 1954, the Vanderbilts lost control of their own railroad in a stock battle. In 1968, the once mighty New York Central was merged into Penn Central. And in 1970, Penn Central collapsed in what was then the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. The empire the Commodore had built was not merely diminished, it was worth nothing. One by one, the palaces went too. The Newport cottages were abandoned or handed to preservation societies. The Breakers itself was eventually sold to the Preservation Society of Newport County, reportedly for a few $100,000, a rounding error on its cost. The family members who remained were, by mid-century, comfortable at best. One of them, Cornelius Vanderbilt IV, great-great-grandson of the Commodore, worked as a journalist and reportedly burned through millions before dying in 1974 in modest circumstances, married 7 times along the way. When the last of the old guard died, the newspapers no longer described the Vanderbilts as rich. They described them as history, which brings this story back to where it began. A room in Nashville, Tennessee, in 1973, and the single most damning statistic in the annals of American money. The reunion was held at Vanderbilt University, the school the Commodore had endowed with $1 million a century earlier, in the single greatest act of generosity of his life. Roughly 120 of his descendants came. And according to the family's own chronicler, Arthur T. Vanderbilt Sood, who recorded the gathering in his history of the dynasty, there was reportedly not one millionaire among them. Not one. From a fortune that at its height had towered over the treasury of the United States. Within about 70 years of the Commodore's death, some accounts hold no direct descendant remained among America's rich at all. And here is the detail that lands hardest. Of those 10 legendary mansions on Vanderbilt Row, the palaces that announced the family's conquest of New York, not a single one survives. Every last one was sold and demolished, most within a few decades of being built, replaced by office towers and department stores. The 137-room palace of Cornelius II, the largest private house in the city's history, stood for barely 30 years before the wreckers took it. A family that built like pharaohs left, in Manhattan, essentially no tomb. There is one final, bitter irony. Ask anyone today to name a rich Vanderbilt, and 2 names come up. Gloria Vanderbilt, the fashion icon, and her son, the television anchor Anderson Cooper. But Gloria, Reggie's daughter, the poor little rich girl, inherited a trust that was substantial yet a shadow of the old fortune, and the money she became famous for, the denim empire of the 1970s and 80s, she earned herself. When she died in June 2019, at 95, her son inherited comparatively little. Anderson Cooper has said openly that there was no trust fund waiting for him, that he was raised knowing he would have to work. The last famous Vanderbilts, in other words, are famous for money they made, not money they were given. The Commodore started with $100 borrowed dollars and built the greatest fortune in America. 4 generations later, his heirs were back where he began, starting from scratch. He warned them that any fool could make a fortune, and that keeping one took brains. His family spent 90 years, $200 million, 10 palaces, and one entire railroad empire, proving that the old man was right about everything.